Syrian Civil War timeline. Civil uprising, March to July 2011. Incorporated into timeline article January 4, 2018. Early armed insurgency and Kofi Annan ceasefire attempt, July 2011, May 2012. Escalation, May 2012, December 2013. This was the third phase of the Syrian Civil War, which gradually evolved from UN-mediated ceasefire attempt during April to May 2012, deteriorating into radical violence in June, escalating the conflict leveled to a fully fledged civil war. Rise of the Islamist groups, January to September 2014. Fighting between ISIL and other rebel groups, January to March 2014. Tension between moderate rebel forces and ISIL had been high since ISIL captured the border town of Azaz from FSA forces on September 18, 2013. Conflict was renewed over Azaz in early October, and in late November ISIL captured the border town of Utmay from an FSA brigade. On January 3, 2014, the Army of the Mujahideen, the Free Syrian Army and the Islamic Front launched an offensive against ISIL in Aleppo and Idlib governorates. A spokesman for the rebels said that rebels attacked ISIL in up to 80% of all ISIL-held villages in Idlib and 65% of those in Aleppo. By 6 January, opposition rebels managed to expel ISIL forces from the city of Raqqa, ISIL's largest stronghold and capital of the Raqqa governorate. On 8 January, opposition rebels expelled most ISIL forces from the city of Aleppo. However, ISIL reinforcements from the Deir ez-Zor governorate managed to retake several neighborhoods of the city of Raqqa. By mid-January, ISIL retook the entire city of Raqqa, while rebels expelled ISIL fighters fully from Aleppo city and the villages west of it. On 29 January, Turkish aircraft near the border fired on an ISIL convoy inside the Aleppo province of Syria, killing 11 ISIL fighters and 1 ISIL emir. In late January, it was confirmed that rebels had assassinated ISIL's second-in-command, Haji Beker, who was al-Qaeda's military council head and a former military officer in Saddam Hussein's army. By mid-February, the al-Nusra Front joined the battle in support of rebel forces, and expelled ISIL from the Deir ez-Zor governorate. By March, the ISIL forces fully retreated from the Idlib governorate. On 4 March, ISIL retreated from the border town of Azaz and other nearby villages, choosing instead to consolidate around Raqqa in an anticipation of an escalation of fighting with al-Nusra. Government offensives, March to May 2014. On 4 March, the Syrian army took control of Sahel and the Kalamon region. A few days later they took over Zara, in Homs governorate, further blocking rebel supply routes from Lebanon. And soon, along with Hezbollah, took control of the Remov Arms region near Yabrud, followed by Yabrud itself. Also in March, the Syrian army captured Ras al-Ain, Al-Huzn and the villages of Flita and Ras Mara near the border with Lebanon. Meanwhile, rebels in the Dara governorate captured Dara prison and freed hundreds of detainees, later taking control of the Kesab border post in the Latakia governorate, where NDF leader and one of Bashar al-Assad's cousins was killed by rebel fighters near the rebel-controlled Kesab border post, Hilal al-Assad, and most of Khan Sheikhoun and Hama. In April, rebels captured the town of Babylon, Idlib. They stormed the government-held Ramawseh industrial district in Aleppo in an attempt to cut the army supply route between the airport and a large army base, and later the Rashdan neighborhood and parts of the Jamiat al-Zahra district. On 26 April, the FSA announced they had begun an offensive against ISIL in the Raqqa governorate, and had seized 5 towns west of Raqqa city. In the same month, the Syrian army took control of Rankis in the Kalamon region, Al-Zabadani and Tal Barak near the town of Mashar in Knitra. On 7 May, a truce went into effect in the city of Homs. The terms of the agreement included safe evacuation of Islamist fighters from the city, which would then fall under government control, in exchange for release of prisoners and safe passage of humanitarian aid for New Bull and Zara, 2 Shiite enclaves besieged by the rebels. Presidential election, June 3, 2014. Syria held the presidential election in government-held areas on June 3, 2014. For the first time in the history of Syria, more than one person was allowed to stand as a presidential candidate. More than 9,000 polling stations were set up in government-held areas. According to the Supreme Constitutional Court of Syria, 11.63 million Syrians voted, the turnout was 73.42%. President Bashar al-Assad won the election with 88.7% of the votes. The Iranian official Alaeddin Burujerdi read a statement by the group saying the election was free, fair and transparent. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the European Union and the United States all dismissed the election as illegitimate and a farce. Amongst other concerns, due to Kurdish and ISIL control of Syrian territories, there was no voting in roughly 60% of the country. ISIL government conflict intensifies, July 2014, September 2014. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, SOHR, ISIL took control of the Shar oil field on July 17, 2014. On 20th July, the Syrian army secured the field, although fighting continued in its outskirts. On 25th July, ISIL took control of the Division 17 army base near Raqqa. In August, it took the Brigade 93 base in Raqqa, the towns of Akhtarin and Turkmenbair from rebels in Aleppo and a handful of nearby villages. On 14th August, after being captured by the al-Nusra Front, Free Syrian Army Commander Sharif Assafouri admitted to working with Israel and receiving anti-tank weapons from Israel. It is possible this confession was obtained under duress. On the same day, the Syrian army and Hezbollah militias retook the town of Mlaya in Rif Dimashq Governorate, which had been held by the Islamic Front. Rebels had used the town to fire mortars on government-held areas inside Damascus. Meanwhile, ISIL forces in Raqqa were launching a siege on Tabqa Air Base, the Syrian government's last military base in Raqqa, and attacking the Kuwaiz Air Base in Aleppo. On August 16, 2014, there were reports that 22 people were killed in the village of Dar by a car bomb outside a mosque thought to be detonated by ISIL, who also seized the village of Beidin in Aleppo Governorate from rebels. On August 17, 2014, source said that in the previous 2 weeks ISIL jihadists had killed over 700 tribal members in oil-rich Deir-ez-Zor Governorate. On 19 August, Abu Abdullah al-Iraqi, a senior figure in ISIL who had helped prepare and plan car and suicide bombs across Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, was killed. In Raqqa, the Syrian army took control of the town of Al-Ahel. ISIL reportedly sent reinforcements from Iraq to the governorate of Raqqa. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said at least 400 ISIL fighters had also been wounded in the previous 5 days in clashes with the Syrian Army and National Defense Force in Raqqa alone. At the same time, several senior UK and US figures urged Turkey to stop allowing ISIL to cross the border to Syria and Iraq. It was around this time that the Americans realized that the Turks had no intention of sealing their side of the border, and so Washington decided to work with the Syrian Kurds to close off the border on the Syrian side. On August 26, 2014, the Syrian Air Force carried out airstrikes against ISIL in the governorate of Deir-ez-Zor as the Syrian army pulled out of Raqqa and shifted to Deir-ez-Zor for its oil and natural gas resources, as well as strategically splitting ISIL territories. American jets began bombing ISIL in Syria on September 23, 2014, hitting at least 20 targets in and around Raqqa were hit, according to SOR. Participating in the strikes with the United States were Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Jordan, using fighters, bombers and Tomahawk missiles, according to the Pentagon. U.S. intervention, September 2014, September 2015. Raqqa and Kobani. U.S. aircraft including B-1 bombers, F-16s, F-18s and Predator drones were deployed, with F-18s flying missions off the USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77, in the Persian Gulf, and Tomahawk missiles being fired from the destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, in the Red Sea. The U.S. informed Syria's envoy to the UN that strikes will be launched against the terrorist group in Raqqa, and also informed the Free Syrian Army beforehand of the impending airstrikes. The U.S. attacked a specific faction of al-Nusra called the Khorasan Group, who according to them had training camps and plans for attacking the U.S. in the future. Turkey launched an official request to the UN for a no-fly zone over Syria in September 2014. The same day, Israel shot down a Syrian warplane after it entered the Golan area from Knidra. By October 3, 2014, ISIL forces were heavily shelling the city of Kobani and were within a kilometer of the town. In the 36 hours from 21 October, the Syrian Air Force carried out over 200 airstrikes on rebel-held areas across Syria, and US and Arab jets attacked his positions around Kobani. Syrian Information Minister Omran al-Sobi said the YPG forces in Kobani had been provided with military and logistical support. Syria reported its air force had destroyed 2 fighter jets operated by ISIL. By January 26, 2015, the YPG had forced ISIL to retreat from Kobani, fully recapturing the city. The U.S. later confirmed that the city had been cleared of ISIL forces, and ISIL admitted defeat in Kobani city 3 days later, although they vowed to return. The Southern Front and Northern Army of Conquest, October 2014, June 2015. In February 2014, the Southern Front of the Free Syrian Army formed in southern Syria. 6 months later, they started a string of victories in Dara and Knitra during the 2014 Knitra offensive, the Dara offensive, the Battle of Al-Shaykh Maskin, the Battle of Basra, 2015, and the Battle of Nazib border crossing. A government counter-offensive, the 2015 Southern Syria offensive, during this period, that included the IRGC and Hezbollah, recaptured 15 towns, villages and hills, but the operation slowed soon after installed. Since early 2015, opposition military operations rooms based in Jordan and Turkey began increasing cooperation, with Saudi Arabia and Qatar also reportedly agreeing upon the necessity to unite opposition factions against the Syrian government. In late October 2014, a conflict erupted between the al-Nusra Front on one side and the Western-backed SRF and Hazm movement on the other. Al-Nusra Front SRF/Hazm movement conflict. By the end of February 2015, al-Nusra had defeated both groups, captured the entire Zawiya mountain region in Idlib province and several towns and military bases in other governorates, and seized weapons supplied by the CIA to the 2 moderate groups, including a few BGM-71 anti-tank missiles similar to weapon systems al-Nusra Front had previously captured from government stockpiles. Reuters reported that this represented al-Nusra crushing pro-Western rebels in the north of the country. According to some FSA commanders, however, the elimination of Harakat Hazm and the SRF was a welcome development due to the leaders of those factions involved in corruption. By March 24, 2015, the al-Nusra Front dominated most of Idlib province, except for the government-held provincial capital, Idlib, which they had encircled on 3 sides along with their Islamist allies. They formed a joint coalition of Islamist forces, the Army of Conquest, and on 28 March captured Idlib. This left the north largely taken over by Akrar ash-Sham, al-Nusra Front and other Islamist rebels, with the south of the country becoming the last significant foothold for the mainstream, non-jihadist opposition fighters. A new rebel offensive was launched in the northwest of Syria, and by 25 April the Army of Conquest had captured the city of Jisr al-Sugar. At the end of May, the rebels had seized the al-Mastuma military base, and Araha, leaving government forces in control of tiny pockets of Idlib, including the Abu Dwar military airport. According to the Brookings Doha Center, the Army of Conquest coalition was a broad opposition effort to ensure that the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front was contained, with the rearguard involvement of Western-backed factions being regarded as crucial. However, it seemed to some observers that the FSA in northern Syria had by this point all but dissipated, with many of the moderate fighters joining more extremist organizations, such as Akrar ash-Sham, the largest faction in the Army of Conquest. Rebel advances led to government and Hezbollah morale plunging dramatically. In northwest Syria, these losses were countered by a Hezbollah-led offensive in the Kalamon Mountains north of Damascus, on the border with Lebanon, that gave Hezbollah effective control of the entire area. Resurgent ISIL advance, May 2015, September 2015, US and Australia commence airstrikes. On 21 May, ISIL took control of Palmyra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, after 8 days of fighting, and also captured nearby towns and oil fields. They then conducted mass executions in the area, killing an estimated 217 to 329 government supporters and soldiers. According to opposition activists, government sources put the number at 400 to 450. By early June, ISIL had reached the town of Hasha, which lies on the main road from Damascus to Homs and Latakia, creating a potential disaster for the government and raising the threat of Lebanon being sucked further into the war. On 25 June, ISIL launched 2 offensives. One was a surprise diversionary attack on Kobani, while the second targeted government-held parts of al-Hasaka city. The ISIL offensive on al-Hasaka displaced 60,000 people, with the UN estimating a total of 200,000 would be displaced. In July 2015, A raid by U.S. Special Forces on a compound housing the Islamic State's chief financial officer, Abu Sayyaf, produced evidence that Turkish officials directly dealt with ranking ISIL members. ISIS captured Qaryatayn city from the government on August 5, 2015. Australia joined the bombing of ISIL in Syria in mid-September, an extension of their efforts in Iraq for the last year. On 2 August, U.S. officials informed Reuters that the United States had decided to allow airstrikes to help defend against any attack on the U.S.-trained Syrian rebels, even if the attackers come from forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The following day the Pentagon announced that it would begin flying its first unmanned, armed drone missions in Syria. Russian intervention, September 2015, March 2016, including first partial ceasefire. Russian intervention. On September 30, 2015, in response to an official request by the Syrian government, the Russian aerospace forces began a sustained campaign of airstrikes against both ISIL and the anti-Assad FSA. Initially, the raids were conducted solely by Russian aircraft stationed in the Khmeimim air base in Syria. Shortly after this, U.S. President Barack Obama said that the U.S. would continue to support the Syrian opposition. On 7 October, Russian officials said ships of the Caspian Flotilla had used 26 sea-based cruise missiles to destroy 11 ISIL targets in Syria. That day, the Syrian government launched the Northwest Syrian offensive that in the following few days succeeded in recapturing some territory in northern Hama Governorate. On 8 October, the U.S. officially announced the end of the Pentagon's $500 million program to train and equip Syrian rebels and acknowledged that it had failed. However, other covert, larger CIA programs to arm anti-government fighters in Syria continued. 2 weeks after the start of the Russian campaign in Syria, the New York Times opined that the conflict was turning into an all-out proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. Despite multiple top-ranking casualties incurred by the Iranian forces advising fighters in Syria, the Russian-Syrian-Iranian Hezbollah offensive targeting rebels in Aleppo went ahead in mid-October. U.S. airstrikes, Vienna peace talks, disagreements Russia/Iran versus Western powers. At the end of October, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter signaled a shift in the strategy of the U.S.-led campaign, saying there will be more airstrikes and ruling in the use of direct ground raids, the fight in Syria concentrating mostly on Raqqa. On 30 October and 2 weeks later, Syria peace talks were held in Vienna, initiated by the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, in which on 30 October Iran participated for the first time in negotiations on Syrian settlement. However, the participants disagreed on the future of Bashar al-Assad. On 10 November, the Syrian government forces completed the operation to break through the ISIL insurgents' blockade of the Qirs air base in Aleppo province, where government forces had been under siege since April 2013. In mid-November, in the wake of the Russian plane bombing over Sinai and the Paris attacks, both Russia and France significantly intensified their strikes in Syria, France closely coordinating with the U.S. military. On 17 November, Putin said he had issued orders for the cruiser Moskva that had been in eastern Mediterranean since the start of the Russian operations to work as with an ally, the French naval group led by flagship Charles de Gaulle, then on her way to the eastern Mediterranean. Shortly afterwards, a Russian foreign ministry official criticized France's stridently anti-Assad stance and airstrikes against oil and gas installations. In his remarks to a French delegation on 14 November, President Bashar Assad sharply criticized France's and other Western states' actions against the Syrian government. On 19 November, President Obama said he was unable to foresee a situation in which we can end the civil war in Syria while Assad remains in power, and urged Russia and Iran to stop supporting the Syrian government. On 20 November, the UN Security Council, while failing to invoke the UN's Chapter 7, which gives specific legal authorization for the use of force, unanimously passed Resolution 2249 that urged UN members to redouble and coordinate their efforts to prevent and suppress terrorist acts committed specifically by ISIL, as well as all entities associated with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. The adopted resolution was drafted by France and co-sponsored by the UK the day after Russia introduced an updated version of a draft resolution that was blocked by the Western powers as seeking to legitimize Assad's authority. November to December 2015, Turkey shoots down Russian plane, Syrian army camp bombed, UN Res. 2254 Transitional Plan. On 24 November, Turkey shot down a Russian warplane that allegedly violated Turkish airspace and which crashed in northwestern Syria, leading to the pilot's death. Following the crash, it was reported that Syrian Turkmen rebels from Syrian Turkmen brigades attacked and shot down a Russian rescue helicopter, killing a Russian naval infantryman. A few days later, Russian aircraft were reported to have struck targets in the Syrian town of Raqqa in Idlib province, causing multiple casualties. On 2 December, the UK government voted to expand Operation Shader into Syria. 2 British Tornado aircraft took off from RAF Akrotiri that night, each carrying 3 paveway bombs, and 2 further aircraft were deployed later. All aircraft returned without their bombs. UK Defence Secretary Michael Fallon said that the strikes hit the Elmar oil fields in eastern Syria, and that 8 more jets were being sent to RAF Akrotiri to join the 8th already there. On 7 December, the government of Syria condemned as an act of flagrant aggression strikes by US-led coalition warplanes, which had fired 9 missiles at its army camp near Ayesh, Deir al-Zour province on the evening prior, killing 3 soldiers and wounding 13. Several vehicles, heavy machine guns and an arms and ammunition depot were also destroyed. Coalition spokesman denied it was responsible. Anonymous Pentagon officials alleged later that day that the Pentagon was certain that a Russian warplane had carried out the attack, but this claim was denied by the Russian military spokesman. The UN Resolution 2254 of December 18, 2015 that endorsed the ISSG's transitional plan but did not clarify who would represent the Syrian opposition, while condemning terrorist groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda, it made no mention of the future role of Syrian President Bashar Assad. January 2016, Syrian army pushes north and retakes Al-Shaykh Maskin in the southwest. On January 12, 2016, the Syria government announced that its army and allied forces had established full control of the strategically situated town of Salma, a predominantly Sunni village in the mostly Alawite northwestern province of Latakia, and continued to advance north. On 16 January, ISIL militants launched a raid on government-held areas in the city of Deir ez-Zor and killed up to 300 people. Counterstrikes by Russian fighter jets, in support of Syrian army forces, took back the areas. On 21 January, Russian activity apparently aimed at setting up a new base in the government-controlled Qamishli airport was first reported. The northeastern town of Qamishli in the Al-Hasaka governorate had been largely under the Syrian Kurds' control since the start of the Syrian-Kurdish Islamist conflict in July 2013. Similar activity by the U.S. forces was suspected in the Ramallah air base in the same province, 50 kilometers, 31 miles, away from the Qamishli airport. The area was controlled by the U.S.-backed Kurdish People's Protection Units, YPG. On 24 January, Syrian government forces seized the predominantly Sunni Rabia, the last major town held by rebels in western Latakia province. Russian forces were said to have played an important role in the recapture, which threatened rebel supply lines from Turkey. By January 26, 2016, the Syrian government established full control over the town of Al-Shaykh Maskin in the Dar governorate in southwestern Syria, thus completing the operation that had begun in late December 2015. Several analysts considered this a turning of the tide for the Syrian government, citing the significance of military help from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, considering that rebels had once controlled about 70% of the province. February 26, 2016, partial ceasefire. On February 26, 2016, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2268 that endorsed a previously brokered U.S.-Russian deal on a cessation of hostilities. The ceasefire started on February 27, 2016 at 0:00, Damascus time. The ceasefire does not include attacks on UN-designated terrorist organizations. At the close of February 2016, despite individual clashes, the truce was reported to hold. By the end of March, the Syrian government forces with support from Russia and Iran successfully captured Palmyra from the ISIL. By early July 2016, the truce was said to have mostly unraveled, violence again escalated, and the fighting between all the major parties to the conflict continued. At the end of July 2016, the fighting between the government and Islamist rebels in and around Aleppo intensified. SDF advances, Turkish military intervention in northern Syria, Euphrates Shield, August to October 2016. Note: headings deviate from the timeline of the Syrian Civil War article from this point on. On August 12, 2016, the Syrian Democratic Forces fully captured the northern city Manbij from ISIL and some days later announced a new offensive towards Al-Bab, which could eventually connect the Kurdish regions in northern Syria. On 19 August, the Pentagon warned the Syrian government against interfering with coalition forces or our partners in the northeastern region near the city of al-Hasaka, adding that the U.S. had the right to defend its troops which were operational in the area. On 22 August, the Kurdish YPG, having captured Wa'aran, the only major Arab neighborhood in the northeastern city of al-Hasaka that had been in government hands, launched a major assault on al-Hasaka to seize the last government-controlled areas of the city. After a Russian mediation team failed to mend the rift between the two sides, the next day the capture of the city was completed. On 24 August, Turkey's armed forces invaded Syria in the northern city of Jarablus area controlled by ISIL, starting what the Turkish president called Operation Euphrates Shield, aimed against both the ISIL and Kurdish terror groups that threaten our country in northern Syria. The Syrian government denounced the intervention as a blatant violation of its sovereignty and said that fighting terrorism isn't done by ousting ISIS and replacing it with other terrorist organizations backed directly by Turkey. The PYD leader Salih Muslim said that Turkey was now in the Syrian quagmire and would be defeated like ISIL. The same day, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden indirectly endorsed Turkey's move and said that the U.S. had made it clear to the Syrian Kurdish forces that they should move back east across the Euphrates, or lose U.S. support. As Turkish troops and the Turkish-aligned Syrian rebels took control of Jarablus and moved further south towards the Syrian town of Manbij, they clashed with the Kurdish YPG, which led U.S. officials to issue a warning to both sides. U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter specified that the U.S. did not support Turkey's advance south of Jarablus. This warning, as well as an announcement made by the U.S. of a tentative ceasefire between the Turkish forces and the Kurds in the area of Jarablus, were promptly and angrily dismissed by Turkey. Nonetheless, combat between Turkish forces and the SDF died down, and instead Turkish forces moved west to confront ISIL. In the meantime, the SDF continued to reinforce Manbij. On 12 September, a U.S.-Russian brokered ceasefire came into effect. 5 days later, the U.S. and other coalition members jets bombed Syrian army positions near Deir ez-Zor, purportedly by accident, but with Russia contending that it was intentional, killing at least 62 Syrian troops who were fighting ISIL militants. On 19 September, the Syrian army declared it would no longer observe the truce. On the same day, an aid convoy in Aleppo was attacked, with the U.S. coalition blaming the Russian and Syrian governments for the attack, but these governments denying this and blaming terrorists for the attack. On 22 September, the Syrian army declared a new offensive in Aleppo, and on 14 December the final rebel stronghold in Aleppo was recaptured by the Syrian government, followed by a ceasefire agreement. Raqqa Campaign, November 2016 to 2017. On 26 October, the U.S. Defense Secretary said that an offensive to retake Raqqa from ISIL would begin within weeks. The SDF, using up to 30,000 Arab, Christian and Kurdish troops, and with support from the Western Coalition, undertook an operation codenamed Wrath of Euphrates. By December 2016 it had captured many villages and land west of Raqqa previously controlled by ISIL, and by January 2017, much of the land west of Raqqa had been seized and the second phase of the operation was complete. Aleppo recaptured, Russian/Iranian/Turkish-backed ceasefire, December 2016, April 2017. In December 2016, Syrian government forces completely recaptured all of rebel-held parts of Aleppo, ending the 4-year battle in the city. On 29 December, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a new ceasefire deal had been reached between the Syrian government and opposition groups, excluding UN-designated terrorist groups such as ISIL and Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, with Russia and Turkey acting as guarantors and Iran as a signatory, which came into effect at 0:00 Syrian time, 2:00 UTC, on 30 December. Talks were scheduled to be held between the groups in Astana, capital of Kazakhstan, on 15 January. On the same day, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported that 4 million people in Damascus and surrounding areas were without reliable access to water after major supply infrastructure had been targeted, and called upon all parties to guarantee basic services. On January 2, 2017, Rebel groups said that they would disengage from planned talks after alleged ceasefire violations by government forces in the Wadi Barada Valley near Damascus. At the end of January, government forces managed to capture Wadi Barada and the water supply of Damascus was restored. On 14 February, the ceasefire between Assad forces and rebels collapsed throughout the country, leading to fresh clashes in various locations and a fresh rebel offensive in Daraa. A new peace conference in Geneva was held on 23 February, the same day as Turkish forces captured Al-Bab from ISIL northeast of Aleppo. Syrian government forces started an offensive east of Aleppo to conquer Deir Hafir from ISIL and prevent further Turkish advances. On 17 March, Syrian military fired S-200 missiles at Israeli jets over Golan Heights. The Israeli military claimed that the Arrow anti-ballistic system intercepted one missile, while the Syrian military claimed that they had downed an Israeli jet. The Russian Foreign Ministry summoned the Israeli ambassador for talks. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria reported that on 20 March up to 150 civilians were killed near a school in Raqqa by US-led coalition airstrikes. Government forces entered Deir Hafir, the last stronghold held by ISIL in East Aleppo, and secured it by 23 March. This opened up an opportunity to push south into the Raqqa Governorate. However, on the same day, an SDF contingent landed on a peninsula west of Raqqa via boats and helicopters in an effort to cut off the Syrian Arab army from entering the ISIL's de facto capital, Raqqa. On 28 March, an agreement was reportedly brokered by Qatar and Iran for the evacuation for 4 besieged towns in Syria. The deal involved evacuating the residents of Al-Fuwa and Kafriya, 2 towns in the Idlib governorate besieged by rebel forces, in exchange for the evacuation of residents and rebels in Zabadani and Madaya, 2 towns under siege by government forces in the Rif Dimashq governorate. Syrian-American Conflict, De-Escalation Zones, April 2017, June 2017. After the chemical attack on Khan Sheikhan, warships of the U.S. Navy launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at the Syrian government's Shayrat air base, which was said to be the source of the chemical attack. The American attack, taking place on April 7, 2017, was the first officially announced deliberate attack on Syrian government forces. Due to being launched without authorization from Congress or the UN Security Council, the strike triggered an emergency UNSC meeting. Russian President Putin viewed the U.S. attack as an act of aggression against a sovereign country violating the norms of international law. The U.S. representative responded that the moral stain of the Assad regime could no longer go unanswered. American forces struck the Syrian military again on 18 May, when a Syrian army convoy advancing in the vicinity of the border town of Al-Tanf, which hosted a U.S.-controlled airbase, came under attack by U.S. fighter jets. Nevertheless, the Syrian government's desert offensive continued, and on 9 June government forces secured a part of Syrian-Iraqi border for the first time since 2015. Meanwhile, intense fighting between government forces and rebel groups that began north of Hama on 21 March continued. By 29 March, government forces, which had halted the rebel offensive at the outskirts of Hama, began a counterstrike, and by 16 April had reversed all rebel gains. By the end of April they had captured the towns of Hafaya and Tabat al-Imam. On 12 April, the agreement to exchange the inhabitants of the rebel-held towns of Zabadani and Madaya with the inhabitants of the pro-government towns of Al-Fuwa and Kafriya began to be implemented. On 15 April, a convoy of buses carrying evacuees from Al-Fuwa and Kafriya was attacked by a suicide bomber in Aleppo, killing more than 126 people. On 24 April, the Turkish Air Force conducted several airstrikes on YPG and YPJ positions near Al-Malikiyah. The attacks were condemned by the U.S. On 4 May, Russia, Iran, and Turkey signed an agreement in Astana to create 4 de-escalation zones in Syria: the Idlib Governorate, the northern rebel-controlled parts of the Homs Governorate, the rebel-controlled eastern Ghouta, and the Jordan-Syria border. The agreement was rejected by some rebel groups, and the Kurdish Democratic Union Party or PYD also denounced the deal, saying that the ceasefire zones are dividing Syria up on a sectarian basis. The ceasefire came into effect on 6 May. Halt to CIA program, ISIL declared defeated, Russian forces to be permanent, July 2017 – December 2017. On July 7, 2017, the U.S., Russia, and Jordan agreed to a ceasefire in part of southwestern Syria, Russia giving assurances that Assad would abide by the agreement. On 19 July it was reported that the Donald Trump administration had decided to halt the CIA program to equip and train anti-government rebel groups, a move sought by Russia. On 5 September the government's central Syria offensive culminated in the breaking of the three-year ISIL siege of Deir-ez-Zor, with active participation of Russian Air Force and Navy. This was followed shortly thereafter by the lifting of the siege of the city's airport. On 17 October, after over 4 months of fierce fighting and the US-led coalition's bombardment, the Kurdish-dominated SDF announced they had established full control of the city of Raqqa in northern Syria. At the end of October, the government of Syria said that it still considered Raqqa to be an occupied city that can only be considered liberated when the Syrian Arab Army entered it. By mid-November the government forces and allied militia established full control over Deir-ez-Zor and captured the town of Abu Kamal in eastern Syria, near the border with Iraq, and Iraq's town of Al-Qaim, which was concurrently captured from ISIL by the Iraqi government. On 6 December Russia declared Syria to have been completely liberated from ISIL. On 11 December President Putin visited the Russian base in Syria, where he announced that he had ordered the partial withdrawal of the forces deployed to Syria. On 26 December, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Russia had set about forming a permanent grouping at its naval facility at Tartus and Mimim Air Base. 2 days later, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia believed that the U.S. forces must leave Syrian territory completely once remnants of the terrorists were completely eliminated. Army advance in Hama province and Ghouta, Turkish intervention in Afrin, January to March 2018. On 20 January, the Turkish military began a cross-border operation in the Kurdish-majority Afrin canton and the Tel Rifat area of Shaba canton in northern Syria, against the Kurdish-led Democratic Union Party in Syria, PYD, its armed wing People's Protection Units, YPG, and Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, positions. In February 2018, the Syrian army and its allies continued to advance against the forces of Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and other rebels in the Hama governorate. On 10 February, the Syrian Air Defense Force shot down an Israeli F-16 fighter jet in response to an Israeli cross-border raid on Iranian targets near Damascus through Lebanese airspace. On 21 February, the government began an operation to capture rebel-held Ghouta east of Damascus. The operation started with an intensive air campaign. On 18 March, on the 58th day of the Turkish military operation in Afrin, Operation Olive Branch, the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, TFSA or FSA, Turkish armed forces and disparate rebel groups captured Afrin from the YPG and the YPJ, displacing up to 200,000 people. Shortly after the capture, TFSA militants looted parts of the city and destroyed numerous pro-Kurdish symbols as Turkish army troops solidified control by raising Turkish flags and banners over the city. The battle was seen as an overall strategic victory, because it would open a ground corridor into nearby Idlib province, a stronghold for al-Qaeda-linked militants, as well as linking them with other rebel factions that wanted to join the coalition there. Turkey's relationship with the U.S. was stretched to breaking point by the Afrin operation, which pitted the two NATO allies and their Syrian proxies against one another. Douma chemical attack, U.S.-led missile strikes, Southern Syria offensive, April 2018 – August 2018. On April 7, 2018, a chemical attack was reported in the city of Douma, with 70 people killed and 500 injured. On-site medics stated the cause of those deaths was exposure to chlorine and sarin gas. The Syrian government denied any use of chemical weapons. Following the incident in Douma, the UN Security Council failed to adopt 3 competing resolutions on an inquiry into the alleged chemical attack, with Russia and the US clashing over the issue. Following the incident, Syrian government forces entered and established control over the city of Douma, ending the 5-year siege of Ghouta. On 14 April the US, UK and France launched missile strikes on multiple government targets in Syria as a response to the suspected chemical attack in Douma. On 19 April the Syrian army and allied Palestinian groups began an offensive against the Yarmouk camp for Palestinian refugees in southern Damascus, which had been partially occupied by ISIL. On 21 May, pro-government troops fully recaptured Yarmouk camp, thus allowing the Syrian Arab Army to fully control the capital after 6 years. On 1 May, the U.S. government announced the U.S.-led coalition's operations to liberate the final ISIS strongholds in Syria, which would ensure that populations liberated from ISIS are not exploited by the Assad regime or its Iranian supporters. In May, Israel launched an extensive strike against Iranian targets in Syria, known as Operation House of Cards, after a series of short military confrontations between Israeli and Iranian forces in Syria. On 6 July, as a result of the southern Syria offensive, which had begun in June, the Syrian army backed by Russian forces reached the border with Jordan and captured the Nazib border crossing. By the end of July, the southern Syria offensive ended, resulting in the complete Syrian government's control of Daraa and Knitra provinces. On 17 September, Israel hit multiple targets in western Syria. While trying to strike the Israeli planes, Syrian forces shot down a Russian plane, causing the deaths of 15 Russians. The strikes occurred a few hours after a Russo-Turkish agreement to create a demilitarized zone around Idlib governorate was achieved, which postponed an imminent offensive operation by Syrian government forces and its allies. Russia blamed Israel for the incident. Russian Defense Ministry's spokesman Igor Konashenkov named the Israeli military as the sole culprit of the accident. In the aftermath of the strikes, on September 24, 2018, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu confirmed that the Syrian army would receive S-300 air defense missile systems to strengthen Syria's combat air defense capabilities. He added that the previous cancellation of the contract for S-300 delivery in 2013 had been due to Israel's request, but following the downing of the Russian aircraft in Syria the situation had changed. The S-300 has modern IFF systems which would prevent the missiles from targeting Russian aircraft. Idlib demilitarization, U.S. withdrawal from Syria, September 2018 to 2018. On September 17, 2018, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reached an agreement to create a buffer zone in Idlib. On 12 December, the Turkish government announced it would begin operations against Rojava, the Democratic Federation of northern Syria, in a few days, in an apparent rebuke of U.S. efforts at ensuring Turkish border security in the area. In response, the Pentagon said that any unilateral military action taken in northern Syria where U.S. forces are operating would be unacceptable. However, President Trump abruptly announced on December 19, 2018 the withdrawal of all troops from Syria, after which Turkey postponed the planned attack. Late on 25 December, Israel launched an attack from or across Lebanese airspace, in response to an anti-aircraft missile launched from Syria. According to the IDF, Russia condemned the strikes as provocative and said that they directly threatened two airliners. Reports from Syria said an arms depot in Qatifa, about 40 kilometers northeast of Damascus, was hit, injuring 3 soldiers. On 28 December, government forces were said to be on the outskirts of the strategically important northern city of Manbij, but the city was still held by Kurdish forces and U.S. troops were still there.